Ivan Lendl stepped into tennis history with indisputable numbers. 270 weeks, holding the world #1 ranking. One of the longest periods of dominance the ATP has ever recorded. 94 titles big and small across every surface. 8 Grand Slam titles, including 3 Roland Garros, 3 US Open, and 2 Australian Open, along with 19 Grand Slam finals appearances, a record at the time of his retirement. He was the center of power in tennis during the 1980s, the man who ended and closed the era of players relying purely on inspiration, replacing it with an entirely new model: tennis of physical fitness, scientific training, meticulous tactics, and ruthless preparation. Lendl didn't just win tournaments, he shaped the way people would have to win in the future. Those heavy baseline shots, machine-like endurance, the ability to sustain peak form throughout an entire season, turned him into the standard that later generations had no choice but to follow. In the eyes of American sports history, Ivan Lendl was not just a champion. He was a power structure, a cold standard of greatness. But right behind those perfect numbers lies a void that was never filled. Lendl carried within him the pain of a man who always had to prove his worth, yet never received affection in return. He won in silence, lost in silence, and lived his entire career feeling like he stood outside the circle of public emotion. There was no moment of unconditional love, no stage that called his name with warmth. Lendl's greatest pain wasn't the losses, it was that every victory demanded he become colder, tougher, more isolated. And it was precisely in that isolation that his will was forged to a ruthless level. Keep fighting when no one cheers. Keep being perfect when no one claps. Ivan Lendl didn't exist because of being loved. He existed because of discipline and the survival instinct of a man who accepted being recorded by history without needing to be embraced. Because for him, simply continuing to stand tall was already a victory painful enough. If the story of Ivan Lendl leaves you silent in the face of a kind of greatness that doesn't need to be loved, please hit subscribe so we can continue the journey together into the most painful chapters behind that legend. Right from when he was a child, Ivan Lendl entered this world with a destiny already written in achievements, not in affection. He was born into a family where tennis wasn't a game, wasn't weekend fun, it was discipline, it was duty, it was the measure of a person's worth. Both his parents were top tennis players in Czechoslovakia, people accustomed to scoreboards, rankings, being judged by results rather than emotions. In that house, no one asked Ivan if he was happy, if he was tired, if he was afraid. They only looked at how the boy hit the ball, whether he won or lost, whether he improved or stalled. Achievement was the only accepted language, and Ivan learned to speak that language before he even learned how to express his own emotions. Lendl's childhood wasn't lacking in material things. He had courts to practice on, coaching, every condition needed to become a great athlete. But within that abundance was a cold emptiness that no racket or trophy could ever fill. There were no words of praise when the boy did well, because doing well was simply expected. There was no hug after a long practice session because fatigue was seen as weakness. There was no comfort when he lost, because losing wasn't allowed to happen. Ivan grew up in an environment where love wasn't given through words or gestures, but through expectations. And expectations, when never met with acknowledgement, gradually turn into burdens. Young Ivan quickly understood that to survive in his family, he had to win. Not to be loved more, but to avoid disappointing anyone any further. Each victory didn't bring joy. It only brought temporary peace, a brief moment when he could exhale, knowing that today he hadn't let anyone down, but tomorrow he'd have to do it all over again. It was precisely in that harsh loop that Lendl developed a survival instinct. Don't expect recognition. Just focus on not making mistakes. Emotions were pushed aside to make room for absolute control. At school, Ivan wasn't the kind of kid people usually remember fondly. He wasn't the center of laughter, not the storyteller, not the one loved by everyone. He was the serious, quiet kid who always carried the feeling that he had to try harder than others just to stand on equal ground. Other kids could be loved simply for existing. Ivan wasn't. He learned that his existence only had value when tied to results. And when a child grows up believing that, they gradually lose the ability to believe they deserve unconditional love. The absence of those seemingly small gestures, a compliment, a hug, a proud look, left a deep crack in Lendl's soul. He wasn't consciously aware of it as a child, but he felt that coldness every single day. It made him withdrawn, guarded with his own emotions. It taught him that hoping for recognition was a risk, and risks had to be eliminated. So Ivan chose the only way he knew to survive: become so good that no one could ignore him, become so strong that no one could doubt him. But the tragedy lies in this. When a child is raised on achievements without love, they grow into a man who doesn't know how to accept affection even when it shows up. Lendl carried a lifelong hunger for recognition, but he never learned how to admit it. He didn't demand praise, didn't seek hugs, because he was too used to standing alone. Instead, he turned that deficiency into fuel for his will, into the drive that pushed him to train harder, more strictly, with no mercy toward himself. That's why, when looking back at Ivan Lendl's childhood, people don't see a story of poverty or loud tragedy. They see a subtler, quieter, but far deeper tragedy. The tragedy of a child perfectly prepared to win, but never prepared to feel love. And from that moment on, Lendl's life path was set. He would become a great champion, but he would also carry for the rest of his life an unsatisfied craving for acknowledgement. He lacked nothing to succeed, yet he lacked the one thing that makes success feel warm: the feeling of being loved simply for being himself. Ivan Lendl's childhood wasn't shaped only by his family. It was also enveloped by a far colder social space: socialist Czechoslovakia, where people were taught how to survive before they were allowed to dream. It was a world where every path had already been mapped out, where individuals weren't encouraged to choose, and certainly weren't encouraged to ask questions. In that context, sports weren't simply personal joy or ambition, they were state property, a tool to demonstrate the strength, discipline, and prestige of the system. An athlete didn't belong to themselves. They belonged to the flag, the slogans, and the record books used to tell a story much larger than the person themselves. Ivan grew up in a country where freedom wasn't a familiar concept. From a very young age, he understood that every step he took lay within an invisible but rigid framework. Where he went, where he competed, who he met, how much prize money he received, everything was decided by hands he never saw. In that world, sports didn't allow for spontaneity. It demanded absolute obedience. And for a boy already accustomed to living in a family of achievements, that environment only reinforced a brutal lesson: the individual doesn't matter. Only results have value. In Cold War Eastern Europe, a great athlete wasn't celebrated as a unique personality. They were seen as a successful product of the system. Their victories didn't belong to them. They belonged to the state. Their failures weren't just personal defeats. They were collective shame. Ivan Lendl grew up under that pressure, carrying a burden he had never chosen. He had no right to say whether he wanted to or not. He only had the right to carry it out. No one asked the boy Ivan whether he loved tennis or not. In a society like that, such a question was unnecessary. It was in that atmosphere that Ivan learned how to be silent. Silence not because he had no thoughts, but because thoughts weren't encouraged to be expressed. Asking why meant trouble. Showing emotion meant weakness. And dreaming, in a system that prized control, was an unaffordable luxury. Ivan wasn't taught how to voice his desires. He was taught how to complete tasks. Every training day, every tournament, every trip carried the same unspoken message: don't speak, don't ask, just endure. That endurance wasn't heroic, it was survival. In a society where any deviation could be remembered, staying silent was the safest way to exist. Ivan learned that emotions had to be hidden, and even joy shouldn't be shown too openly. Even victory had to be celebrated just enough, never beyond the permitted limits. This created a painful paradox: an athlete who wins but isn't allowed to feel the win in his own way. Lendl's teenage years passed in prearranged competition trips, in training sessions where the goal wasn't personal growth but maintaining performance. He had no right to choose a different path, nor was he allowed to imagine a future outside the set framework. Any personal dreams had to come after duty, and if there were moments when Ivan felt different, felt he wanted more, he learned to swallow that feeling inside. Because in his world, silence wasn't just the safest choice, it was the only choice. That very environment honed Lendl into a special kind of person: tough, self-controlled, and almost emotionless in expression. But the price paid for that adaptation was enormous. When a person learns to survive by extinguishing desire, they gradually forget how to dream. Ivan grew up with a rare ability to withstand pressure, but also with a hard-to-name void in his soul. He wasn't allowed to imagine a different life, one where he could choose, fail, try, and be wrong. When looking back at those years, it's clear why Ivan Lendl became such a cold champion. Not because he lacked emotion, but because he was taught that emotion had to be tightly controlled. Not because he didn't know how to dream, but because he learned to see dreaming as dangerous. In that cold Eastern European world, Ivan wasn't permitted to be a curious child or a rebellious teenager. He was forged into an endurance machine, a person who knew how to survive by not demanding anything, and that lesson followed him his whole life. When he later stepped into the wider world, into the West, onto the global tennis stage, Ivan Lendl carried with him the legacy of silence. He wasn't used to talking about himself. He wasn't used to explaining emotions. He was used to letting results speak for him. But deep down, that silence wasn't absolute strength. It was the trace of a youth suffocated of choice, of a person who learned to endure before learning to live. Eastern Europe taught Ivan Lendl how to survive, but it also took away his ability to dream freely. And from there, Ivan Lendl's path was paved with great victories, yet always covered by a thick layer of silence, where every step forward was paid for by suppressing emotion and accepting that, for many of his early years, simply existing had already been a harsh enough battle. When Ivan Lendl began winning at the international level, people didn't look at him with admiration, but with scrutiny. The titles came earlier than expected. The consecutive wins against big opponents made the name Lendl appear constantly on the rankings, but they didn't bring the corresponding recognition. In a world accustomed to celebrating explosive geniuses, fiery personalities, Lendl appeared as something out of place. He won too early, too consistently, too coldly, and so, instead of being congratulated, he was doubted. People asked how he won, instead of acknowledging that he deserved to win. The whispers started following every step forward. He was called a product of the system, a machine-trained player, someone who benefited from Eastern European discipline more than from personal talent. Some said he lacked the artistic quality of tennis, the spontaneity that moves the audience. Others were more blunt. They didn't believe a player like Lendl could become an icon. Each of his victories was therefore never seen as final proof. It was just a new question being raised. How long could he keep it up? And did he really deserve the position he was in? In that atmosphere, Lendl had no privilege to enjoy success. When a match ended, he wasn't allowed to breathe a sigh of relief, because right away, another match was waiting, along with a bigger challenge, proving that the previous win wasn't luck. Each title wasn't a reward. It was a reminder that the standard set for him would only get higher. No one said, "Congratulations." They only said, "Do it again, and do it better." The most painful thing wasn't the open criticism, but the absence of belief. Lendl felt very clearly that he was walking on a thin tightrope, where one slip would mean everything he'd achieved could be denied. There was no safe zone, no moment allowed for mistakes. For other players, a loss could be seen as an accident. For Lendl, it would become proof that the previous doubts were right. That pressure didn't come from any specific opponent. It came from the very atmosphere surrounding him. Internally, Lendl didn't rebel. He didn't complain. He was already too accustomed to being placed in a state of having to prove himself since he was a child. But when success came early, that doubt dug even deeper into a simmering unease. Am I good enough? Or am I just temporarily ahead before being pulled back to where others think I belong? Instead of nurturing confidence, victory made Lendl more wary of himself. He trained more strictly, not allowing himself to relax even for a single day. At the point when others began basking in the spotlight, Lendl withdrew into discipline. He reviewed every shot, every tactical decision, every smallest lapse, not to perfect his style, but to eliminate risk, because in the world he existed in, risk meant giving others an excuse to say he didn't deserve it. Each victory, therefore, didn't bring relief. It only added more weight to the expectations pressing on his shoulders. There was a bitter paradox in those years. The more he won, the less he was trusted. People waited for the moment he would collapse, not out of malice, but because they didn't know where to place him in the familiar story of tennis. He didn't fit the role of the romantic hero, nor the image of the rebel. He was a winner who needed no explanation, and that very fact left others confused. Instead of changing their perspective, they chose to doubt. For Lendl, this created a cruel spiral. Victory didn't give him inner validation. It only made him fear that next time he wouldn't have enough strength to maintain that standard. He never learned how to be proud of himself. He only learned how not to allow himself to weaken. Confidence, if it existed, never blossomed. It was compressed into a form of hard, cold will, enough to keep him moving forward, but not enough to warm his heart. And so, Ivan Lendl's early years of success weren't the brilliant prelude to a legend, but a heavy sequence of endless proving. Each victory came to him not like an open door, but like a slippery step he was forced to climb, even when his legs were already tired. He wasn't allowed to stop and enjoy, because behind him were doubting eyes, and ahead was the demand to be even more perfect. It was in that context that Ivan Lendl began to understand his path would never be one of congratulations. It would be a path of pressure after pressure, where every win didn't bring trust, but only piled a new, heavier burden onto his shoulders than the one just set down. When Ivan Lendl officially stepped into the world #1 position, the moment every athlete dreams of, he didn't feel any sense of release. There was no relief, no explosive joy, no feeling of, finally, I've arrived. Instead, there was an invisible tightening, as if that very peak had just closed the last door leading back to the ordinary human world. From that second onward, Ivan Lendl was no longer just an outstanding tennis player. He became the standard, the measuring stick, the shadow that everyone else had to surpass. And when you become the measuring stick, you are no longer allowed to be human. The title of world #1 didn't bring Lendl the love of the public. It brought distance. In the stands, people didn't cheer for him the way they once did for other idols. They watched him with cold respect, sometimes mixed with irritation. His ruthlessly precise shots, his almost inhuman endurance, his near unshakable consistency, left the audience with no cracks to slip affection through. People began calling him the robot, not because he didn't have emotions, but because he didn't let those emotions spill out in the way the crowd expected. And when a person is called a robot long enough, they gradually lose the right to be seen as a real human being. At that peak, Lendl wasn't forgiven for any mistake. For other players, a loss could be seen as a bad day, an accident, a moment of bad luck. For Lendl, failure was a betrayal of expectations. It was immediately dissected, scrutinized, magnified. Every time he lost, the whispers returned. See, he's not as perfect as we thought. The summit turned into a cage, where every movement was watched, where there was no room for weakness or experimentation. He wasn't allowed to be wrong, because his mistakes weren't seen as human, they were seen as evidence. The price of standing at the top was isolation. Lendl realized that the more he won, the further he stood from everyone around him. Opponents saw him as an obstacle to overcome, not as a colleague to share with. The media saw him as an inaccessible figure, cold, unfit for easy stories. The audience saw him as a force, not as a human being. Even in the locker room, the supposed private space of athletes, Lendl felt an invisible distance. He didn't belong to the casual conversations, the laughter that releases pressure. He belonged to discipline, and discipline doesn't have friends. That loneliness didn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It came slowly, seeping into every day, every tournament. Lendl began to understand that victory was not a shield. It didn't protect him from judgment, didn't protect him from being misunderstood, and certainly didn't protect him from deep loneliness. On the contrary, victory made everything more naked. It exposed a bitter truth. At the top, no one wants to stand beside you. They only want to watch you fall. There were moments, standing in the middle of the court, when Lendl clearly felt the coldness of the lights and the thousands of eyes watching him. He knew he was at the center of the tennis world, but he also knew that no hand was ready to touch him the way one human touches another. The applause rang out of obligation, not out of connection. And when the match ended, the silence returned heavier than before. The peak, for Lendl, wasn't a place to stay. It was a place to endure. The most painful thing was that Lendl began to believe in the image others pinned on him. He wondered whether he really was as cold as they said, or whether he had become that way because there was no other choice left. When you are constantly treated like a machine, you gradually learn to operate like a machine in order to survive. Emotions were suppressed, not because he didn't have them, but because he knew that showing them would bring nothing but risk. And so, Lendl chose the safety of discipline over the fragility of emotion. At world number 1, Lendl also had to live with a constant fear. The fear of losing what made him different. Not the fear of losing titles, but the fear of losing the almost inhuman standard he had imposed on himself. Every passing day was a new test. Was his body still strong enough? Was his mind still sharp enough? Just one day of letting go, and he could be pulled down from the peak, and then, all those years of sacrifice would be looked back on as a mistake. That obsession didn't allow him rest, even when no one was directly forcing him anymore. And in that obsession, Lendl gradually understood a truth no one had taught him before. Victory doesn't protect anyone from loneliness. It doesn't fill the voids left by childhood. It doesn't replace unconditional recognition. It only makes those voids clearer, because at the top, there is nothing left to hide them. Standing at the summit, Ivan Lendl looked down and realized he had nowhere to return to except himself. The greatest tragedy of this phase wasn't that Lendl was hated, but that he was misunderstood. He wasn't cold out of arrogance. He was cold because that was the only way to survive in a world that didn't allow him to be wrong. He wasn't distant because he looked down on others. He was distant because he had grown too used to living in silence for far too long. And when people called him a robot, they didn't see that behind that shell was a human being straining to keep everything from collapsing. It was at the peak of his career that Ivan Lendl began to face a truth he had never been prepared to accept. That victory, the thing he had chased his entire life, was not the final reward. It was a prison built from expectations, from scrutinizing eyes, and from the absence of human warmth. And in that prison, Ivan Lendl stood firm through discipline and will, but he also gradually understood that no trophy, no ranking, could ever replace the feeling of being loved. That was the first moment he realized that the path he was walking would never lead to warmth. It would be the path of a man forced to accept victory as a prolonged form of loneliness. Modern tennis, the thing audiences today take for granted, was born from the very being of Ivan Lendl. He didn't just win matches, he changed the way people had to prepare for a match. Before Lendl, tennis was still a stage for inspiration, for explosive moments, for artists with a racket in hand. After Lendl, tennis became a science. Fitness had to be calculated like a formula. Tactics had to be programmed down to the smallest detail. The body had to be trained like an endurance machine. He ushered in a new era, where victory was no longer the result of fleeting inspiration, but the product of ruthless discipline and unrelenting preparation. Those heavy baseline shots like hammers, the grueling training sessions that pushed to exhaustion, the season-long match plans laid out in advance, all of them bore Lendl's mark. Later generations inherited that fruit, took it as the standard, and rarely remembered that the standard was built with the very life of one man. But while tennis evolved, the love for Lendl never grew alongside his legacy. Audiences love what they can touch with emotion, while Lendl gave them a harsh truth. To win, you must sacrifice. And that sacrifice isn't beautiful, isn't romantic, isn't easy to love. People admire the players who use the model Lendl created, but they don't turn back to love the one who created it. As if modern tennis borrowed his life to grow up, then left him behind cold and silent. The professional tragedy of Ivan Lendl lies in the fact that he became the foundation for a world that never fully granted him its warmth. He taught tennis how to win, but tennis never taught the audience how to love him. Each title, he claimed, was filed away in the drawer of respect, not in the space of emotion. People learned from him, copied him, even surpassed him, but very few stopped to ask what he had lost along the way. And Lendl, with a nature forged in silence from childhood, never spoke up to demand an answer. At the moment when his legacy became clearest, when people began calling him the shaper of modern tennis, Lendl felt an emptiness that was hard to name. He had given this sport everything he had: his youth, his health, his emotions, and even his capacity for carefree love. But what he received in return wasn't love. It was dry recognition. Tennis remembers him through tactical diagrams, training curricula, generations of athletes born from his philosophy. But in the emotional memory of the audience, he still stands on the sidelines, like a great architect who never lives in the house he built. That price didn't appear in one dramatic moment. It accumulated through the years. Each season, Lendl watched tennis become more and more like what he had once vaguely envisioned: more brutal, faster, more demanding. And at the same time, he realized he was drifting further from the primal joy of the sport. Tennis became work, then duty, then responsibility. It was no longer a place to seek joy. It was a place to execute discipline. And when joy disappeared, all that remained was an emptiness covered by victory. The tragedy lies in the fact that even after changing an entire sport, Lendl still couldn't find the connection he had lacked since childhood. Tennis didn't come back to love him, because tennis has no capacity to love. It simply kept operating according to the rules he had set. And in that cycle, the man Ivan Lendl gradually dissolved into his own legacy. He became an icon, a model, a textbook example, but he was rarely seen as a human being who had paid an unimaginable price to create all of it. There is a silent pain in realizing that a great legacy doesn't equal wholeness. Lendl built a world where later athletes could succeed more, endure more, be more complete. But in that very world, he found no place for himself. He no longer belonged to tennis as joy, nor to the audience as an emotional story. He stood on the fragile line between greatness and loneliness, where the greater the legacy, the clearer the void inside. And so, while tennis marched forward, celebrating new successes built on his foundation, Ivan Lendl gradually understood that some victories bring no response. Some legacies are erected through absolute sacrifice, yet never return to their creator the feeling of being loved. He changed tennis, but tennis took his life in the quietest way. His legacy is a historical miracle, but the emotion it left him with is a prolonged emptiness, where victory is no longer joy. It is only proof that he gave more than anyone ever realized. Wimbledon wasn't just a tournament for Ivan Lendl. It was a cut running the length of his entire career, a void that was never filled, a question he carried his whole life without ever finding the answer. If there was one place in this world where Lendl prepared the most perfectly, sacrificed the most, and also lost the most, it was Wimbledon. Not Roland Garros, not the US Open, not the Australian Open, but the green grass where he always stood at the threshold, but was never allowed to step through. Lendl understood very clearly what Wimbledon meant. He knew it was the final measure of greatness in the eyes of the public, the place where tennis history was written not just with victories, but with emotion. And that's exactly why Wimbledon became an obsession. Not because he had never won there, but because he knew that without winning Wimbledon, everything he had done would always be seen as incomplete. For a man who grew up on achievements, who lived his whole life to be perfect, that phrase, "not enough," carried a terrifying weight. Ivan Lendl didn't see Wimbledon as an ordinary challenge. He saw it as a problem that had to be solved at any cost. He analyzed the grass court like a scientist dissecting data. He changed his playing style, adjusted his footwork, accepted giving up the things that had helped him dominate on clay and hard courts. He even sacrificed entire seasons, skipping other tournaments just to focus on a single goal, conquering Wimbledon. That was no longer desire. That was duty, a command he imposed on himself. Twice he reached the Wimbledon final. Twice he stood at the closest point to the dream any tennis player could touch. But those same 2 times, Wimbledon closed the door, not with a humiliating collapse, not with a forgettable defeat, but with losses that left people speechless. Lendl didn't lose because of poor preparation. He didn't lose because of lack of determination. He lost in moments when tennis, the sport he had devoted his entire life to, refused to repay his sacrifice. The most painful thing wasn't the result, but the feeling of helplessness. Lendl had done everything that could possibly be done. He trained more strictly, more scientifically than anyone. He changed himself to the point where he no longer recognized himself on the grass, but Wimbledon seemed indifferent to effort. It didn't reward cold perfection. It demanded something else, a romance, a naturalness, something Lendl had never been taught how to express. After each Wimbledon failure, Lendl didn't complain. He didn't make excuses. He went back to the practice court, back to the familiar discipline, as if enduring a little more, sacrificing a little more, would finally open that door. But year after year, Wimbledon remained there immovable, unforgiving. It became the symbol of a limit that even greatness couldn't overcome. The public looked at those failures and drew a simple conclusion. Lendl wasn't suited for Wimbledon. But for Lendl, it wasn't a story of mismatch. It was a story of being rejected after giving everything. Each passing season without Wimbledon deepened that not enough feeling a little more. It didn't explode into tragedy. It smoldered, persistent, seeping into every victory elsewhere. Every trophy he lifted carried a shadow, the trophy that didn't exist. At some point, Lendl began to understand that Wimbledon was no longer just a title. It was a sentence, a life sentence without a verdict, where he was convicted by the very standards he had lived by. He was convicted for believing that if he was perfect long enough, the world would give him what he deserved. Wimbledon proved the opposite. Some things cannot be achieved, even when you've done everything right. The tragedy of Wimbledon didn't end when Lendl retired. It followed him off the court, into his memories, into the way history tells his story. Every time his name is mentioned, the Wimbledon chapter appears like a quiet parenthesis. One of the greatest tennis players, but never a Wimbledon champion. That but doesn't need to be shouted. It echoes in silence. And the most heartbreaking thing is that Wimbledon didn't take away Lendl's career. It took away his ability to feel complete. It turned a great career into a story that always feels unfinished. Lendl didn't collapse because of Wimbledon. He kept winning, kept dominating, kept standing at the top of the world, but inside, he carried the feeling that one part of his life would forever remain unfulfilled. This isn't the story of a single failure. This is the story of being quietly, repeatedly rejected, until that rejection became part of his identity. Wimbledon didn't defeat Ivan Lendl on the scoreboard. It defeated him in the deepest place, the belief that sacrifice would ultimately be rewarded. And so, Wimbledon became the central tragedy of his life. Not loud, not dramatic, no tears needed, just a door closed forever in front of a man who waited his entire career. After Wimbledon, Ivan Lendl kept on winning. The rankings still listed his name at the very top. The trophies kept being lifted. The numbers kept piling up thicker. But from that point on, one thing had changed forever. The feeling of truly living in victory never came back. The titles that arrived after Wimbledon no longer carried the taste of joy. They felt like procedures completed exactly according to protocol. Flawless, unsurprising, without any elevation. Lendl was still the best, but he was no longer someone heading towards something. He was just continuing, like momentum that doesn't know where to stop. Matches ended. The crowd still clapped. The media still noted it. But inside Lendl there was a void that was hard to name. He realized that no title anymore had the power to make up for what had been lost. Wimbledon didn't just take away one trophy. It took away the feeling that victory could complete a journey. From then on, every championship was merely confirmation that he was still good, not a step closer to wholeness. The moments that once made his heart race, that once sent adrenaline surging, gradually faded away. What remained was discipline operating a body that had grown too accustomed to winning. Lendl still trained brutally, still prepared meticulously, still refused to let himself slack off, even for a day. But the motivation had changed. Before, he fought to prove something, to conquer, to finish a story. After Wimbledon, he fought to keep from collapsing. Every victory now wasn't a destination. It was a barrier, holding back the emptiness from flooding in. He won to keep everything from falling apart, not to celebrate. And when victory becomes a defense mechanism, it loses its ability to bring happiness. There were days when Lendl stepped onto the court feeling he had been there too many times already. The same lights, the same sound of the ball bouncing, the same expectant eyes. But inside, he no longer expected anything from himself. Not because he had gotten worse, but because he had understood that no result would ever be enough to fill the void that had formed. People could say he had everything: titles, the #1 ranking, the respect of history. But they didn't see that precisely because he had everything. He also had nothing left to hope for. The smoldering tragedy was that Lendl never collapsed. He didn't break down, didn't fall into a public crisis, didn't lose his form right away. He stayed steady, stayed cold, stayed perfect. But that steadiness belonged to someone who had stopped waiting for emotional reward. The new trophies didn't make him smile any longer. The applause didn't linger inside him after the court lights went out. Everything passed like facts that needed to be recorded and then filed away. In the rare quiet moments, Lendl began to feel clearly a cruel truth. He had won so much that he no longer knew what he was winning for. Before, every victory was an answer to doubt. Now, there were no more questions to answer. His career continued, but the inner story had stopped. No more climaxes, No more peaks. Only the extension of a role he had played for too long. Outsiders looking in might think Lendl was living in glory, but inside, he began living in repetition. Different tournaments, different surfaces, different opponents, all of it felt like variations of the same script. And in that script, Wimbledon was always present like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Every new title unintentionally reminded him that there was one title that never came. Not in a sharp, painful way, but in a grinding way, day after day. Lendl never spoke about this. He was never the type to voice his pain. He kept behaving the way he always had. Strict, focused, silent, but that very silence was the clearest sign of emotional exhaustion. He no longer sought recognition. He no longer resisted the coldness. He simply existed in victory, like someone who had grown used to living in a room without windows. And that was the most tragic moment of this phase. Ivan Lendl still won, but he no longer lived in victory. Victory was no longer an experience. It was a state, a dry, colorless, odorless, echoless state. He didn't lose his greatness. He lost the ability to feel that greatness belonged to him. What remained was a legacy still being built, while the man building it drifted further and further from his own emotions. After Wimbledon, Ivan Lendl's path never collapsed. It continued solid, impressive. But deep beneath that solidity was a truth only he knew clearly. Nothing could make up for the feeling of being unfinished. And when a person wins without feeling like they are truly alive anymore, that isn't a loud failure. That is the quietest tragedy sports can produce. After Wimbledon, when the emotions had run dry, Ivan Lendl's body began to speak for the things he had never uttered. It didn't scream. It didn't collapse right away. It cracked slowly, like a wall that had borne too much load for too long. Back pain came first, aching, persistent, like a reminder that every perfect shot left an invisible fracture. Then the hips stiffened after every practice session, making each step no longer effortless. The shoulders were no longer perfectly obedient tools. Every swing became a negotiation with pain. His body turned into a battlefield where discipline and injury wrestled every single day. Lendl didn't see pain as a signal to stop. He saw it as data to be managed. Instead of resting, he adjusted. Instead of lightening the load, he restructured. Training sessions were broken into smaller parts, intensity distributed like a cold spreadsheet. But pain didn't follow logic. It arrived in the morning when he got out of bed, crept into his back when he bent to tie his shoes, and trailed him through every set like an unwilling companion. There was no moment of pain gone, only moments of can endure. In those years, Lendl lived in a brutal paradox. To maintain perfection, he had to keep paying with his body. Every increase in fitness was a risk. Every extended match was a gamble. But he didn't know any other way to survive. When victory no longer brought emotion, discipline became the last anchor. And discipline, at its most ruthless level, shows no mercy to the one who enforces it. There were days when Lendl stepped onto the court with a body that hadn't recovered yet. Back pain squeezed his breathing. Hips restricted his stride. Shoulders resisted every serve. But he still played, because for him, stopping meant admitting that perfection had limits. He refused to allow those limits to exist. So, the body had to carry the decisions his mind wouldn't yield on. The accumulating fatigue wasn't just in the muscles, it was in every movement. Lendl knew every new weakness that appeared in himself. He learned to hide them, adjust tactics to reduce impact, change rhythm to stretch endurance. But every adjustment was a small compromise, and every compromise was a cut into the perfect image he had built. The bitter part was, even while compromising, he still didn't allow himself to let go. The body was crushed not because of lack of preparation, but because of preparation taken too far. In this phase, the titles he won carried a different weight. They were heavier not because of their historical value, but because of the price paid. Each trophy was a new debt to the body. Each time he lifted a cup, he knew tomorrow would hurt more than today, and Lendl accepted it with a terrifying calm. He didn't romanticize the pain, he recorded it like an operating cost. One title, one pain, one season, one scar. In the long nights after matches, when the lights were off, Lendl faced his body in silence. No audience, no scoreboard, just labored breathing and pain that wouldn't sleep. There, he understood most clearly the truth no one saw on court. Perfection isn't free. It erodes from the inside. It demands sacrifice not just of youth, but of the future. Every ache was a reminder that he was steadily drawing down his life's capital to pay for the standards he himself had set. Physical breakdown didn't come like an accident. It came as an inevitable process. Lendl wasn't felled by one single injury. He was worn down. Back pain became chronic. Hips lost their former elasticity. Shoulders gradually lost reliability. And when the parts began to betray him, he didn't blame them. He understood they had done more than their share. They had carried not just the weight of competition, but the weight of expectations, of discipline, of a life that didn't allow mistakes. In the public eye, Lendl remained the symbol of strength and endurance. But inside, he began living with a cold awareness. No victory comes without leaving a mark, and those marks don't disappear as the career continues. They accumulate, layer upon layer, until the body becomes a map of the titles paid for. Every point of pain is a chapter closed by effort that exceeded limits. It is here that the tragedy of perfection stands most naked. Not in the losses, but in the wins that made the body pay. Lendl didn't lose his will. He gradually lost his wholeness. And when a person keeps moving forward while the body is already depleted, that is no longer a story about sports. It is a story about a will that has gone farther than the body can follow. Ivan Lendl understood this more clearly than anyone. He didn't see himself as a victim. He saw himself as someone who had chosen. But that choice had a cost. Every pain was a title paid for. And when the pains became constant, he knew that his career wasn't recorded only in numbers and trophies, but in the very limits his body had been forced to surpass. Ivan Lendl's retirement didn't come as an event. It came as a disappearance. No big announcement, no farewell ceremony, no brightly lit stage for the man who had dominated tennis for nearly a decade. After everything he had given to the sport, his moment of leaving happened in absolute silence, as if history quietly closed a door and moved on without looking back. For Lendl, that wasn't a shock. It was the logical continuation of a life always accustomed to living in silence. His body had spoken long enough. Chronic back pain no longer allowed him to prepare in the way he believed was worthy of his own standards. Shoulders and hips no longer met the ruthless demands that the peak required. But what made Lendl leave wasn't just the physical. It was the exhaustion of an inner drive that had been worn down over too many years. When victory no longer brought the feeling of being alive, when stepping onto the court became only duty, Lendl understood that prolonging his career at that point would be a betrayal of his own philosophy. He didn't organize a farewell. There were no promises to return, no tears in front of the cameras. He simply stopped. To the outside world, that silence was confusing. People expected an explanation, an emotional moment, an exclamation point for a glorious chapter. But Lendl didn't give them that. He had spent his entire life letting results speak for him. When there were no more results, he chose to say nothing at all. The tragedy lies in the fact that that silence wasn't filled with the deserved gratitude. No immediate honors, no swelling wave of thanks, no sense that an era had just closed. Tennis kept operating, tournaments kept happening, new faces kept appearing. The man who had once been the standard, once the pinnacle, slipped away like a shadow into the background. No one deliberately withheld his thanks, but no one stopped long enough to offer it either. For Lendl, this didn't cause anger. It caused emptiness, because deep down, He was already used to not being congratulated. From the first victories that were doubted, to the years at the top when he was called a robot, to the unforgiven failures at Wimbledon, he had learned to exist without emotional recognition. But when he left, even the minimal acknowledgement didn't come, and that void stood out more clearly than ever. Not as a new wound, but as a final confirmation. He had never truly been embraced. There is a bitter paradox in the way Lendl retired. He left tennis exactly the way he had lived in tennis, quietly, disciplined, undemanding. But because of that, history treated him in the same way. No noise, no drama, no promise that people would remember him as he deserved. In that moment, the man who once dominated tennis became an ordinary person, stepping out of the lights with no one waiting. The silence after retirement wasn't peace. It was a vacuum. A person accustomed to the harsh rhythm of competition suddenly faced days without schedules, without pressure, without specific goals. For many, that is freedom. For Lendl, it was disorientation. When an entire life has been defined by moving forward, suddenly stopping creates the feeling of having gravity stripped away. He was no longer number one, no longer a rival, no longer a threat. He was just himself, and that self had never learned how to exist outside of discipline. People might say Lendl chose the way he left. That's true, but that choice didn't make the tragedy lighter, because choosing silence was also choosing to accept that there would be no belated thanks, no ending written in emotion, just a small line in history: Ivan Lendl retires. And that's it. In the big picture of tennis, that disappearance was almost invisible. But for Lendl himself, it was the moment of facing a cold truth. You can give this sport everything, but it doesn't owe you a goodbye. And so, the man who once dominated tennis left as if he had never existed, carrying a great career without an emotional conclusion. Ivan Lendl didn't collapse when he retired. He also wasn't lifted up. He simply stepped off the stage, leaving behind the trophies, the numbers, and a silence longer than any applause. That wasn't a tragic ending in the loud sense. It was the most painful ending, when a legend leaves and the world doesn't stop in time to say thank you. After leaving the court in silence, Ivan Lendl stepped into another chapter of life, one without scoreboards, without referees, without grandstands. There was only family and a quiet fear he had never dared name while he was still competing: the fear of becoming his own father. Lendl has 5 daughters, 5 small lives, 5 different personalities, 5 chances for him to redo what he knew he had lacked throughout his own childhood. But even in his family, he didn't step in with confidence. He stepped in with caution, with care, with a question hanging in the air. Can a man raised in discipline and silence ever learn to love in the true sense of the word? He didn't push his daughters into sports. That decision wasn't impulsive. It was a silent vow. Lendl understood the price of turning achievement into the only language. He had lived in that language for too long. He knew it could create champions, but it could also erode childhood, cut off other paths before they even had a chance to open. So in his own home, he tried not to repeat the old pattern. No brutal training schedules, no expectations to be the best, no eyes measuring success and failure. Only choice, something he himself had never had. But affection wasn't a skill Lendl had been taught. He was awkward in moments that called for softness. He rarely gave compliments, not out of stinginess, but because he had never learned how to say them. He showed love through steady presence, through driving them around, through listening in silence, through small, unshowy actions. To outsiders, that might look like distance. To him, it was the greatest effort to keep love from becoming pressure. There were quiet evenings, when the house was asleep, when Lendl faced a question no one else asked him except himself. Is this enough yet? He wasn't seeking perfection in the role of father. He was seeking difference. Different from what he had experienced, different from a childhood where hugs were rare and praise was a luxury. But breaking a generational cycle of emotion doesn't happen in one lifetime. It happens slowly, full of hesitation, and with no guarantee of success. His 5 daughters grew up in a home not haunted by rankings, but the shadow of discipline was still there, not as commands, but as routine. Lendl didn't say, "You must." He said, "You can." He learned to ask questions, even if sometimes they came too late. He learned to listen, even though silence remained his familiar reflex. In those moments, he realized that being a father isn't about winning. It's about patience. And patience, unlike discipline, requires a softness he once saw as risk. The human tragedy lies in this. Even when he did things right, Lendl still wouldn't allow himself to call it happiness. He called it responsibility, compensation, an attempt to keep history from repeating. He didn't stand on a pedestal as the father who did well. He stood in the position of someone making amends for a fault not entirely of his making, but one he inherited, making amends by restraining expectations, making amends by expanding choices, making amends by accepting that his children didn't need to become perfect versions of anyone. There were moments when he felt out of place in his own family, as if learning a new language too late in life. His daughters' laughter didn't follow the rhythm he was used to. Their dreams didn't need 5-year plans. And in that difference, Lendl felt both fear and gratitude. Fear because he couldn't control it. Gratitude because control was no longer necessary. He understood that if there was one true victory outside the court, it was the victory over the instinct to repeat. Not pushing sports didn't mean standing aside. Lendl was present when needed, stepped back when he should. He learned to let his daughters decide for themselves, even when their decisions bore no resemblance to any path he had ever known. Each time he managed that, he felt a little lighter, not explosive joy, but quiet relief, as if one old link in the chain had been removed, even though the chain itself was still there. This isn't happiness in the complete sense. No triumphant march, no feeling of "it's finished." This is belated atonement, happening day by day, through small choices, through persistence no one records. Lendl didn't seek recognition for being a father. He only sought enough difference so his children wouldn't have to grow up with the same void. And in that effort, Ivan Lendl faced a gentle truth he had never allowed himself to believe while competing. A person's worth isn't in how many wins they have, but in how many wounds they didn't pass on. He might not call it happiness, but it was the closest thing to peace he had ever touched. A peace without noise, without titles, existing only in the daily attempt to do things differently so the children in front of him could grow up freer than he ever did. After family, after the belated effort to atone so he wouldn't become his own father, Ivan Lendl chose yet another path, living in voluntary darkness. Not because he resented the world, but because he was too tired to keep being seen. When the lights went out, when the applause fell silent, he didn't try to come back to remind everyone of himself. He consistently avoided the media. No long interviews, no tell-all memoir, no staged comebacks designed to awaken nostalgia. Lendl understood that every appearance came with the demand to explain, to justify, or to play the role of icon, and he no longer had the energy for that. This solitude wasn't escape. It was choice. A carefully considered choice by someone who had spent his entire life under scrutiny. Lendl had lived long enough as an object to defeat, to doubt, to label, to analyze. When he left the court, he wanted to return to being the subject of his own life. He wanted to walk without having to stop and answer questions. He wanted to be silent without being interpreted. He wanted to exist without having to prove anything. Not writing a memoir was also a statement. In a world where legends rush to retell their stories, Lendl chose not to tell, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew words could distort the truth. His truth didn't lie in climaxes. It lay in erosion, not in explosive moments, but in the harsh, repeated days. He didn't want his pain turned into smooth sentences, didn't want his sacrifice packaged into easily digestible inspirational lessons. To him, some things should remain in their raw state. Not making a comeback was also how Lendl protected the most fragile thing he had finally gained: peace. Every invitation to return carried the expectation to play the historical Ivan Lendl, cold, disciplined, great. But the man he was now no longer wanted to carry any more roles. He didn't want to be asked about Wimbledon as if it were a wound that needed endless dissection. He didn't want to be forced to smile at belated praise. He had gone far enough to know that late recognition doesn't erase the years spent without it. Some called this choice arrogance. Some thought it was a waste of legacy. But for Lendl, it was conserving life energy. He had spent too much on perfection. Now he wanted to keep what remained for things that didn't demand performance. Family, a slower rhythm, days without schedules. He didn't need his name mentioned to know he had existed. He didn't need praise to believe he had done his utmost. Living in voluntary darkness was also how Lendl made peace with the truth that the public's love isn't always achievable through achievements. He had tried. He had given everything an athlete could give. When that love didn't come, he didn't force it. He let go, not bitterly, not defiantly. He simply withdrew quietly from the place that had once exhausted him. In those media-free days, Lendl learned to let the world pass without reacting. News came and went. New comparisons appeared and faded. He didn't join in. He didn't argue back. He let history do its work. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a preserved space. There, he wasn't pulled back into old standards. There, he was allowed to be tired without explanation. And perhaps, in that choice to disappear, we see Ivan Lendl most clearly, a man too accustomed to enduring, to keep enduring more. He didn't disappear to get attention. He disappeared because he had lived too long under the lights. He didn't write to be understood. He stayed silent to be at peace. In a world that celebrates voices, he chose the right not to speak. In a culture that celebrates presence, he chose the right to be absent. That isn't a sad ending. It is the necessary rest of a man who had paid enough to be seen. Ivan Lendl chose darkness, not because he feared the light, but because he had come to understand that the light was no longer his place. And in that voluntary darkness, he finally found what his whole life had lacked: the right to live without having to prove anything. When Ivan Lendl accepted stepping out of the spotlight and living in voluntary darkness, he didn't think fate would lead him back to Wimbledon in a different way, quieter, more painful, and also more profound than any time before. Andy Murray entered his life not as a fame project, but as a strange invitation from destiny. Stand in the back, where there are no trophies, no stage, no cheers, and watch your own dream be lived by someone else. Murray came to Lendl carrying a burden very similar to the one Lendl once had: immense talent, colossal expectations, and an obsession named Wimbledon. Britain waited for Murray like an answer to a thirst that had lasted decades. The pressure on his shoulders was no different from a life sentence. And Lendl, the man who had been repeatedly rejected by Wimbledon, saw in Murray not just a tennis player who needed to win, but a soul standing on the edge of the very tragedy he understood all too well. Lendl didn't come to tell his own story. He came to build discipline, to create structure, to help Murray endure the things the audience couldn't see: the grueling training sessions, the brief conversations, the silences that lasted longer than encouragement. Lendl didn't offer Murray easy comfort. He offered Murray what he himself once had: an unrelenting standard. But this time, there was one crucial difference: he didn't force Murray to become him. When Murray stepped into Wimbledon with Lendl standing behind him, it was a heartbreakingly paradoxical image. The man who had once sacrificed his entire career to conquer that grass now stood on the sidelines, watching someone else walk into his own dream. Not holding a racket, not stepping onto the court, not under scrutiny, just observing. And in every match, every tense set, Lendl didn't feel envy. He felt familiarity, the pressure, the silence amid the roaring crowd, the fear of unforgivable mistakes. Then that moment arrived too. Andy Murray won Wimbledon. The stadium exploded. Britain erupted. History was rewritten. In the honors box, Lendl stood there, no trophy, no stage, no name on the golden board. The cameras swept over him very quickly, as if one frame was enough to confirm his presence, then immediately turned back to the new hero. That was the most painful form of honor, witnessing what you spent your whole life failing to achieve, yet no longer yours to grieve publicly. In the moment Murray lifted the Wimbledon trophy high, Lendl wasn't healed. No flood of emotion rushed back through the past to erase the unfinished years. Wimbledon didn't return to apologize. History didn't revise what had been missing. But something else happened, quieter and more silently. Lendl knew for certain that his pain hadn't been meaningless. He had carried all the bitter lessons of his life to help another human being not be crushed by the same machine. He had stood in the background to shoulder some of the pressure, to turn discipline into a shelter rather than a prison. And when Murray won, it wasn't Lendl's victory in the sense of a title. It was confirmation that what he had endured could be transformed into something good for someone else. The tragedy lies in this. Even in that moment, Lendl still wasn't named. He didn't need to be named. But that silence echoed his entire journey, always standing at the edge of collective emotion. Murray was embraced by an entire nation. Lendl stood behind, with no one embracing him. No one asked how he felt, and he didn't wait for that question either. There was a painful maturity in the way Lendl received Murray's victory. He didn't see it as compensation. He didn't fool himself into thinking, finally, Wimbledon belongs to me too. No, he knew the boundary clearly. He knew his wound was still there, but for the first time, that wound was no longer proof of meaninglessness. It became the foundation for something beyond the personal. In the darkness, Lendl watched Murray walk under the light he had once craved, and he didn't turn away. He stood firm. That was the rare courage of a man who accepted that not every dream needs to be completed by oneself to have value. Some dreams are passed on. Some pains are used, so others don't have to endure them the same way. Andy Murray will forever be remembered as Britain's Wimbledon champion, and Ivan Lendl will forever occupy a harder-to-name position. The man who stood behind, the silent architect, the man who carried a wound that never closed, but who learned to let that wound not hurt anyone else. He wasn't healed, but he was certain that his pain had meaning. And for a man who had lived his entire life in the absence of affection, that was perhaps the deepest comfort fate ever allowed. At 65, Ivan Lendl doesn't stand before the world as an icon that needs to be recalled. He stands before himself, with a tired body and a life without response. Post-fame came to him without fanfare, without lights, without ceremony. What remains after a great career is a slower rhythm, mornings that begin more carefully, movements weighed to keep familiar pain from returning. His back no longer lets him forget the past. Hips and shoulders remind him that every step today was paid for long ago. That body doesn't demand pity. It only asks for patience. He appears less, not because he wants to be sought after, but because he no longer needs to be present. Grand events, belated honors, no longer attract him. He doesn't refuse noisily. He simply doesn't show up. In that absence is a clear boundary. No complaints, no demands, no explanations. Lendl doesn't seek sympathy for what was lost. He doesn't ask the world to make up for the years he gave. He understands that if the response didn't come when it was needed most, coming late has no meaning anymore. Memory, for him, is a weight, not because it hurts in explosive ways, but because it's dense. The endless, draining training sessions, the trips that followed one after another without end, the finals he won, and the final he never owned. Wimbledon still sits there in memory, not as a wound to be soothed, but as an undisputed fact. He doesn't dream it again. He doesn't avoid it either. He lets the memory lie still heavy but stable, as part of the structure that formed who he is. At this age, Lendl no longer argues with history. He doesn't rewrite how people tell his story. He doesn't write to counter. He doesn't appear to adjust the tone. His silence isn't helplessness. It's the final choice to preserve what energy is left. There are days when the fatigue doesn't come from the body but from remembering too much. And when that happens, he chooses the simplest thing: keep existing, without adding more noise to a world that's already too loud. Outsiders looking in might call it loneliness, but Lendl doesn't use that word. He calls it enough. Enough not to have to explain. Enough not to have to play a role. Enough not to have to prove. After a lifetime measured by numbers, he allows himself to live in days that don't need measuring. No tournament schedule, no ranking goals, no expectation to be better than yesterday. Just not more painful, not more tired, not straying from what kept him standing through the long road. Declining health taught him to accept a new rhythm: walking instead of running, resting instead of forcing, listening to the body instead of commanding it. This isn't surrender. It's a belated reconciliation between will and limits. He doesn't regret the lost invincibility, because he knows that very invincibility took too much away. There is a strange quality in Lendl at 65, a calm that doesn't need recognition. He doesn't boast about endurance. He doesn't recount the nights of aching. He doesn't turn age into a moral symbol. He simply lives quietly, steadily, without response. And in that lack of response is a rare honesty. Life doesn't owe anyone an explanation. If there is one thing consistent through his being from youth to now, it is never complaining. He doesn't blame the family that taught him to love through achievement. He doesn't blame the society that taught him silence to survive. He doesn't blame tennis for taking everything he had without returning love. Complaining, to him, is a form of depletion, and he has depleted enough. At 65, Ivan Lendl doesn't seek sympathy. He doesn't need soothing from belated praise. He simply continues to exist with a tired body, with heavy memories, with a life that doesn't respond the way people expect. But in that existence, there is a quiet dignity. The dignity of a man who has paid enough for greatness and asks nothing more from the world. There is no miracle waiting for Ivan Lendl at the end of the road. No moment of complete healing where every shortfall is made up for and every pain is erased. And no final victory, no trophy, to close the story with endless applause. His life doesn't operate on the comforting logic people usually expect. It operates on the logic of endurance. Keep going, pay the price, then keep going again, until there's nothing left to exchange except existence itself. Ivan Lendl didn't collapse. That is an undeniable truth. He didn't fall apart in scandal, didn't drown in failure, didn't lose his dignity in front of the public. But the price of not collapsing was a life worn down to the point where there was no room left for sweet illusions. He wasn't loved the way other legends were loved. He wasn't forgiven for the smallest shortcomings. He wasn't allowed to be less than perfect, and so he chose perfection as a way to survive, not as a desire. No healing because not every wound needs, or can, be healed. Some wounds exist to shape a person. A childhood lacking recognition, a society that taught silence instead of dreaming, a career where victory was never enough to bring love, a Wimbledon, forever unfinished. All of it didn't disappear as he grew older. It settled, becoming the foundational structure of who he is. Lendl didn't try to erase it. He lived with it, like living with a part of the body that no longer functions perfectly but still has to be carried. No final victory because his life wasn't a story that rises and closes at the peak. His peak came early, dragged on relentlessly, and ended in silence. After that came years without climax, only the continuation of duty, of role, of choices few people saw. Being a father in a different way, withdrawing from the lights, standing behind so someone else wouldn't have to carry the same obsession, continuing to exist when the body was tired and memory was heavy. No moment of finally everything is okay, only moments of this is how it is. The absolute tragedy of Ivan Lendl isn't that he lacked titles, but that titles never became an emotional refuge. He gave tennis a future modern tennis, scientific, enduring, but tennis never gave him a sense of belonging. He stood at the top of the world, but that top had no arms around him. He sacrificed to complete a dream named Wimbledon, and that very dream became the quiet sentence he carried for life. Not loud, not bitter, just persistently present like a parenthesis that never closes. Yet, to call Ivan Lendl a tragic figure doesn't mean denying his strength. Quite the opposite. His strength lies in the fact that he didn't demand the world be fair to him. He didn't ask history to rewrite its telling. He didn't need soothing from belated praise. He chose silence not because he lost, but because he had paid enough to be seen. In a world where everyone wants to be embraced, he accepted standing outside those arms without resentment. Some people are born to be loved, and some are born to be the foundation. Ivan Lendl belongs to the second group. He didn't give the crowd moments that made hearts tremble, but he gave history a structure that stands firm. Later generations walk on the path he paved with discipline, with science, with unrelenting endurance. They can be loved more, forgiven more, complete more dreams because he bore the harshest part. At 65, looking back, Ivan Lendl doesn't need to say he's proud. His existence is already a statement, a life that didn't collapse, even without being embraced, a life that paid enough, even without response. And in that silence is a dignity no applause can create. The dignity of someone who understood that value isn't in how much love you receive, but in how much you carried so the world could keep going. And so, if the history of tennis stands firm today, if the standard of professionalism, discipline, and complete preparation has become taken for granted, it's because there were people like Ivan Lendl who accepted living an entire life in the absence of collective emotion. Some people aren't embraced by history, but history stands firm because of them. The story of Ivan Lendl leaves a quiet but persistent sadness, because it isn't the tragedy of failure, but the tragedy of a man who did everything right and still received no response. Throughout the journey from a childhood in a family that spoke only in achievements, growing up in Eastern European society where silence was survival, to a dominating career, with 270 weeks as world number 1 and 8 Grand Slams, Lendl always won through discipline and endurance, not through affection. The detail that he sacrificed entire seasons just to prepare for Wimbledon, reaching the final twice but still failing, is the center of the tragedy. It wasn't just losing matches anymore. It was the feeling that his entire life was never allowed to be completed. Standing at the top of the world yet called a robot, not forgiven for mistakes, his victories became a prison rather than a reward. Even more heartbreaking, after Wimbledon, he kept winning titles, but every one felt flat, his body gradually crushed by back pain, hips, shoulders, each pain a title paid for. Retiring in silence, no farewell ceremony, no words of thanks, shows how society easily enjoys the fruits, but often forgets the one who built the foundation. Even when the Wimbledon dream was lived again through Andy Murray, Lendl still stood behind no trophy, no stage not healed, only knowing his pain wasn't meaningless. For the people of the United States, the lesson from Ivan Lendl is clear and very American. Success shouldn't be measured only by results, and society needs to learn to value the human being behind the performance. This story reminds us that discipline and excellence can build a nation, a sport, a system. But without recognition and humanity, the price paid will be lonely people. Honoring Ivan Lendl is also a reminder. Learn to say thank you in time And don't wait until a legend has quietly disappeared. If the story of Ivan Lendl leaves you silent and reflecting on the quiet price of greatness, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue honoring those who built the foundations of history but were rarely embraced. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue telling the real, painful, and very human stories behind the legends.